You got it pegged. Today's episode's all about pivots. So stick around for Life's Potluck Buffet. I'm John Paulus. Thanks for joining me. This all started with a search for the etymology of the word pivot. Oh, and in honor of yesterday's episode, we have to say that the second syllable of pivot contains a vowel that is a schwa. It's written with an O because the word is borrowed from French, pivot, which is the French word for, well, pivot. But unlike the French from which it's borrowed, pivot, the word in English has an unstressed syllable. And so when that happens in English, you know the schwa is going to appear, or there's a very good chance that a schwa-like vowel will appear. And in this case, it's just the straight up, well, we would write it with a schwa. Pivot. It would be the vowel sound. Well, dictionaries don't tend to find a secure etymology for the word pivot. Now, what is a pivot? Well, it started out in French as the literal pivot. So a thing on which something turns or rotates. It could be a cone-shaped thing, a peg or pin-shaped thing, a shaft. But nowadays you mostly hear the word pivot used metaphorically. And that metaphorical usage has been around pretty much forever, despite descriptions to the contrary. I mean, there hasn't been an evolution of pivot in the way that it's sometimes described as starting off as, just a metal point that supports a solid body that it can turn, so that the solid body can turn. That's the main definition from Antoine Furetière's dictionary of 1690. And Furetière is kind of interesting because his dictionary, which is a really nice kind of piece of evidence for a lot of words that you see referenced in places, was not an authorized dictionary in 1690. You see, in 1690, the fairly newly formed Académie Française, which is the quite literally governing body of the French language. It's, English doesn't have such a thing, but French has such a thing. And in the 1600s, Cardinal Richelieu was the patron of this group of intellectuals who were meeting and discussing language, and got Louis XIII, the French king, to basically grant the monopoly on dictionaries to the Académie Française. And that one of the people involved in this project was Antoine Furetière, and he was a very kind of impatient person, it seems. Also maybe a little bit what you might call in the Bay Area hyphy. And so Furetière grew impatient with the Academy and decided that he was going to just publish his own dictionary, and he was going to just do this work solo, and nobody at the Academy liked that, because they said, this is a joint project. That research into these words is not yours to publish, it's ours, and you can't just go off on your own and do it. And so there was a lot of strife, and what ended up happening is that Furetière was expelled from the Académie Française. But Furetière continued work on his project, and eventually a friend of his, Pierre Bayle, who's a famous philosopher and especially on topics like religious tolerance. He himself was in what is now the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, and Bayle ultimately published Fouquetier's dictionary, and I'm sure that that was also to spite the powers that be in France, since Bayle was by no means happy with the situation that was going on in his home country of France. But the reason I mention Fouquetier's dictionary is that it gives us a sense of the word's meaning in France in the 1600s. And there were three meanings. One, as I mentioned, is the physical version of the pivot, the thing on which some solid body turns. And he has other examples. And the second and third definitions are, one is a very interesting one, which has to do with a root of a tree where it's in a perpendicular line to the earth, the surface of the earth. And apparently you can tell by whether or not there is a pivot if the tree was planted by a human being, because the dictionary claims that trees not planted by humans have flat roots. I'm not exactly sure. If you're an expert in this area, please let me know. Put it in the comments. I'm not entirely certain what Fouquetier has in mind with that definition, but that's the second one. And the third one is in a moral sense, is he defines it. And he gives a couple of examples, like a minister is the pivot on which the whole state is supported. So that is the the idea of a metaphorical version of pivot has existed forever. So new metaphorical versions are nothing new. And nowadays, when we talk about pivots, we talk about things like business pivoting when something needs to change because of circumstances. Also, work-life pivoting, where we change jobs or do something different in our work for whatever reason whatsoever. Pivots are everywhere today, and they have been for a very long time. I feel like years ago, the most often you heard pivot to describe a basketball player making a move where they're pivoting. I feel like that was the most common use of the word years ago. But the business pivot and the idea of pivoting in your life and your career and your work has taken that over for sure. There's also the very specific pivot table, which I don't want to get into too many details about this, but what's the best way to imagine the pivot table? Now that I'm thinking about Fouquetier's definition of the difference between the roots of a tree planted by a human being and the roots of a tree planted, but that was kind of naturally arose from a seed that happened on the ground. I feel like it has to do with dimensionality. That's the best way to explain it. The pivot table, it takes a spreadsheet which is flat and allows you to basically develop from that multi-dimensional approaches to the data. So you can take categories whose relationship is not expressed on the kind of flat spreadsheet version of the data, and combine those categories and see how they relate to each other, which isn't clear on the just flat tabular format of the spreadsheet with all that data that you have on it. So that kind of mixing and remixing of data happens through a pivot table. So that's another use of pivot that is figurative, but very apt. So let's ask the cards, what are pivot hinges on? Oh, did you like that? Hinge, another thing that stuff turns on. Door hinge. All right, here we go. Yellow lemons, blue dumplings, magenta noodles. Cards, tell us some things. Okay. Oh, this is a tough one. I guess it's. Here we go. Oh, it's two cards. Cards 44 and cards 45. Cards 40. Wow, that's interesting. They were not. They haven't been in order since I opened the pack, which is a year ago. So this is interesting. They've gotten back into order, in some sense. So card 44 is map your own knowledge. So this is think about what traits in the histories, cultures, and landscapes of where you are, where you want to be, physically or figuratively, how that maps with your identity and aspirations for yourself, and kind of create a map out of that. And that's a really good way to figure out the pivot. And the other piece of advice from the cards today, because they wanted us to have two cards, is understand your style. And that's where you start to explore everything you do, what shows you watch, what you read on a daily basis, even what toothpaste you buy and why. Because once you understand that process about how you arrived at old choices, those new choices that you're going to need to make in your pivot are going to be that much easier. Pivotal even,